we don't wrap. In 6 years, we've never wrapped. What we usually do is run straight into the next run. So,
well, everybody hold on to your hat out there. Fast and Loud is no more.
Richard Rawlings' high-octane persona has long been synonymous with the roar of engines, metal grinding into shape, and the glittering success of his flagship show Fast and Loud. But behind the gleaming chrome and rapid flips, he has now finally confirmed what many had long whispered. There were deeper fissures beneath the spectacle, fissures that ultimately shed light on why his marriages failed, why he suddenly sold off his prized car collection, and why Discovery ended the show. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. When Rawlings stepped into the spotlight, his blend of entrepreneurial swagger and custom car craftsmanship captivated millions. For years, the public saw him as the fearless builder, the dealmaker who could sniff out a wreck and turn it into a head-turner on the show. As the principal of Gas Monkey Garage and star of Fast and Loud, he embodied a myth of relentless momentum. Buy cheap, rebuild fast, sell for profit, keep moving. That momentum made for great television, and it made Rawlings a household name among car enthusiasts and reality TV viewers alike. But at some point, the machinery behind the show, the personal life, the business pressures, the brand expectations, began to grind in unintended ways. The first of these cracks showed up in his personal life. Rawlings has been married 3 times. The first marriage, to Karen Grames in 1993, lasted only about a year. The second, to Suzanne Marie Mergel in 1999, endured for a decade before a 2009 divorce. The two remarried in 2015, only to separate again in 2019. His current marriage to Katarina Deason began in 2020. While on the surface, this sequence may appear like a string of relational misfortunes that happen in the entertainment spotlight, Rawlings now admits the pattern stemmed from something more systemic. According to his own confirmation, the same compulsive drive that powered his on-screen success also hampered his ability to sustain stable relationships. The mania of deal-making and content production left little room for emotional grounding or long-term intimacy. It's not simply that his marriages failed. What he described is a lifestyle that fought against the very commitments marriage demands. In practical terms, the constant chase of the next big build, the tight deadlines, the trips, the public image, all of it began to overshadow the quiet work of partnership and home life. Rawlings acknowledges that the expectation of being on for television, the schedule that demanded new episodes and high-stakes purchases, extended beyond the job and into his personal identity. The same willingness to take risks, financial, mechanical, reputational, powered his garage, but did not translate easily into sustaining the more mundane rhythms of a shared life. With each marriage, the dynamic shifted. Either the spouse tried to acclimate to the pace and public persona, or Rawlings attempted to reduce that pace and found himself restless. The reunited second marriage collapsed in part because he found his identity as star builder at odds with the quieter demands of being husband. He now implies that there was an underlying restlessness, an impulse toward the next attraction, the next project, the next episode that made stability elusive. In parallel to his marital turbulence, Rawlings made a far more public move, the sudden sale of a large portion of his personal car collection. As someone whose brand was built on classic car purchases, flips, and customizations, this move startled fans and industry watchers alike. Why would someone whose brand is dependent on rare metals and horsepower liquidate so much of it? Rawlings' confirmation sheds light. The sale was not merely about raising capital or changing tastes. It was about shedding an older version of himself and freeing his business and brand from the constraints of fixed inventory. He realized that the accumulation of cars had become a liability rather than purely an asset. Garage space, insurance costs, storage, market risk. The spectacle of owning many cars began to weigh more than thrill of flipping them. In his words, the sale represented a recalibration. Move from quantity to quality, from many moderate builds to fewer marquee projects, and from being tied to past inventory to being agile and brand-focused. In the context of the show, this move was symbolic. He was signaling a departure from the fast flip model that had defined Fast and Loud and Gas Monkey Garage's public identity for years. By letting go of the large collection, Rawlings signaled that he and his brand were entering a different phase. one less about rapid turnover and more about selective high-value work. That shift dovetailed with the third major thread, the ending of Fast and Loud. The show premiered in 2012 and ran through 2020, producing 16 seasons and over 160 episodes. But the cancellation shocked many, because the show still had a dedicated following. Rawlings now says the decision to end it was less about declining ratings and more about fundamental misalignment between his creative ambitions, contractual constraints, and brand evolution. He explains that while Fast and Loud was a launching pad, it ultimately boxed him in. The episodic format required a certain pace, a certain flip every episode expectation, and a timeline that didn't allow for deep dives into complex builds or brand extensions. He said his contract with Discovery Channel imposed restrictions. He was unable to freely use social media, unable to promote projects outside the show without network approval, and even restricted in what cars he could share publicly. In short, the show's formula and the network's control clashed with his desire for independence and growth. Rawlings admits he reached a point where continuing the show would have meant staying inside a box that did not fit his evolving vision for his brand or life. So the show ended. At that moment, two things happened. He freed himself from the network's constraints, and he also acknowledged that his personal brand and business were ready for the next chapter. When one looks at the intersection of these three trajectories, the failed marriages, the sale of the car collection, the show's cancellation, a coherent story emerges. In each case, Rawlings reached a juncture where the tension between the show business persona and the individual behind it became untenable. Marriage demands time, presence, vulnerability. The show demanded visibility, speed, performance. Owning dozens of cars might project success, but also ties one down physically, financially, and symbolically. Selling them meant shedding that baggage and reclaiming mobility. The network show provided fame and structure, but also confinement. Ending it opened the door to creative freedom and brand reinvention. Rawlings' confirmation frames all three events not as isolated crises, but as interconnected pivots in his life and career. The implications are manifold. For one, the narrative changes around Rawlings. Rather than viewing the broken marriages as solely personal failures, they become part of a larger arc of transformation. He appears to be making the difficult decision to move away from the pace that made him famous in favor of a life and career built on different terms. That said, the acknowledgement of underlying restlessness and the tension between persona and person invites reflection. The lifestyle that built the empire also sowed seeds of instability. It suggests that the charismatic image of the builder deal-maker comes with a cost to intimacy, consistency, and groundedness. In selling off the car collection, Rawlings chose to relinquish the visible markers of traditional success in favor of something less conspicuous, but arguably more aligned with his evolving identity. That this sale coincided with the show's ending suggests a coordinated repositioning of his brand. From the industry perspective, Rawlings' departure from Fast and Loud highlights the limitations of reality TV formulas for long-term personal and professional sustainability. The show served its purpose, gave him national exposure, reinforced his brand, drew in customers and sponsors, but the same formula that created momentum also created friction. The audience built a set of expectations: to see a restore, flip, sell in each episode, to expect drama, tension, quick payoffs, to see Rawlings as the authoritative figure releasing projects. Once Rawlings began to desire more creative freedom, to pick and choose projects, to restructure his personal brand, to pivot toward different business lines, the show's framework became a liability rather than an asset. In his confirmation, Rawlings essentially says the show ended not because there was no audience, but because the show's structure and contractual terms no longer served his agenda. That nuance reframes the cancellation from failure to strategic exit. He walked away from the show, and with it the constraints, because he believed the next chapter required different rules. For fans, the practical side of his confirmatory statement is that how we view his legacy shifts. It invites viewers to ask, did we follow the persona or the person? Rawlings confirms that the public image, which worked so powerfully for a decade, was deliberately curated and bound by contract, workload, public expectations. The marriage failures and car collection sale were not simply reactive but preemptive, choices made in recognition that what had worked would not sustain. The brand that once glorified constant motion traded pace for purpose, quantity for quality, and public spectacle for strategic focus. Another implication lies in how celebrity and entrepreneurship intersect with identity. Rawlings moves from being star of a reality series to being the controlling force behind his brand, but in different form. That requires shedding old patterns, in his case marriages that failed under the pressure, assets that anchored him, and a show that kept him locked to a formula. His admission suggests awareness of the toll the lifestyle took and readiness to rewrite the script. In confirming the rumors, he invites a new chapter, not just for himself but for the audience to witness a more aligned version of the man behind the logo. It also signals to his business ecosystem, partners, sponsors, fans, that Gas Monkey Garage and Rawlings are entering an era of evolution. The sale of a car collection signals financial reallocation, brand repositioning, perhaps more high-end builds rather than mass flips. The end of his show signals a shift away from network-driven episodic content to perhaps direct-to-consumer, brand-driven media or long-form projects. The pattern is not one of retreat, but transformation. Rawlings is saying he will no longer be the guy who chases the next quick flip for television, but someone who chooses slower burn builds, fewer compromises, and deeper alignment with his values and business goals. That said, the decision to confirm these rumors also has public relations consequences. For the show's fans, the admission of restlessness and the revealing of contractual frustration might feel like a betrayal of the original vibe. The marriages failing and car collection being sold may invite skepticism or cynicism. Was the marquee show always more about persona than authenticity? Rawlings' acknowledgement does not absolve him of responsibility for the relational outcomes, but it does contextualize them. It shifts the conversation from why did he fail personally to why was the system around him predisposed to failure. Moreover, the cancellation of the show, reinterpreted as strategic rather than forced, raises questions about the future of similar reality enterprises. When a celebrity entrepreneur outgrows the show that made them, does the network follow? Can the brand survive without the weekly drumbeat of episodes? Rawlings seems to believe yes, and his confirmation signals that he plans to test that belief. The sale of inventory and the cancellation of the show become not endpoints, but transition points. In sum, Rawlings' coming clean moment reveals a triptych of change: personal relationships strained by identity and pace, a material collection disposed of to reduce burden and signal a shift, and a television platform concluded so that the person behind the platform could evolve. These are not isolated events, but coordinated pivots born of self-realization. Rawlings now stands at a threshold. The figure who built his reputation through speed, spectacle, and visible success is moving into a version of his life where choices matter more than appearances, where fewer but more meaningful builds matter more than more builds for the sake of content, where less is more, and where the persona gives way to the person. His confirmation of the rumors means that the story of Richard Rawlings is no longer simply about cars and flips and television. It's about a man rewriting his terms, refusing the momentum trap he helped construct, and choosing to steer his own engine rather than keep running it at redline for the camera. The revelations from Richard Rawlings did more than explain a few scattered rumors. They peeled back the metallic sheen of a lifestyle built on relentless acceleration. When he finally acknowledged why his personal life, business decisions, and television empire had taken such dramatic turns, it was less a confession than a map of transformation. Having stepped out from under the weight of his show, his cars, and the complicated image that came with being the face of Fast and Loud, Rawlings found himself confronting the machinery of fame itself, how it builds, consumes, and eventually reshapes the person at its center. From the beginning, Rawlings embodied the American fascination with reinvention. A self-made mechanic turned media mogul, he had the rare ability to translate the rough-and-ready garage culture into mainstream entertainment. Fast and Loud wasn't just about engines and restorations, it was about charisma, speed, and a certain outlaw entrepreneurialism. Yet as Rawlings later implied, maintaining that image for nearly a decade took more than skill, it took constant vigilance. Every episode had to feel spontaneous while being perfectly timed for television. Every deal had to carry risk, even if the risks were calculated. The image of a fearless wheeler dealer was both armor and trap, protecting his brand while locking him into a cycle of expectation. Behind that bravado was a man who had to sustain a multi-million-dollar enterprise, a television crew, sponsors, and a legion of employees whose livelihoods depended on the continued spectacle of Gas Monkey Garage. The very persona that made him a hero to fans, the risk-taker, the fast talker, the guy who could close a deal in a parking lot, also made him indispensable to Discovery's formula. Without Rawlings' larger-than-life presence, the show's identity would falter. That dependence created its own pressure cooker. He wasn't just leading a business, he was sustaining a myth. Over time, the constant demand to perform began to bleed into every aspect of his existence. In the same way a car engine starts to overheat after prolonged revving, Rawlings' lifestyle pushed his emotional and physical limits. He had to keep expanding. More builds, more appearances, more partnerships, because stagnation in television means irrelevance. The result was a rhythm that left no room for stillness. This pattern made maintaining personal relationships nearly impossible. Marriage requires quiet. Television demands noise. The private self that might have found balance in the silence of ordinary life was drowned out by production schedules, filming demands, and the constant churn of promotion. What made Rawlings' acknowledgement so striking was his candor about the cost of chasing perpetual visibility. The cars, the fame, the fortune, all were rewards, but each carried an unseen invoice. The failed marriages weren't merely evidence of incompatibility, but proof of how an industry built on spectacle devours domestic stability. When your life's narrative must always be bigger and faster, intimacy becomes another performance rather than a refuge. It's telling that after years of constructing his empire, he would later find himself dismantling parts of it piece by piece. The car collection first, then the television empire, almost as if seeking to strip away layers of machinery until he found what remained of himself beneath. The decision to sell the majority of his collection was emblematic of this reckoning. For most enthusiasts, the cars were sacred artifacts, each a story, a triumph, a mechanical embodiment of passion. For Rawlings, however, they had become emblems of a former life, assets frozen in time, each representing a deal, a season, a chapter in the show's history. By liquidating them, he wasn't simply raising capital, he was disentangling himself from his own mythology. Cars that once symbolized achievement now symbolized obligation. The sale became an act of liberation, the removal of ballast so he could navigate new directions unburdened by nostalgia or expectation. There's also a psychological dimension to this shift. Collectors often surround themselves with symbols of mastery. Rawlings' garage had become a museum of his victories. But museums are static. For a man driven by forward motion, that stasis must have begun to feel suffocating. Selling the cars was a radical gesture of control, an assertion that he would not be defined by trophies from the past. It was, in effect, the opposite of hoarding success. It was curating space for renewal. That gesture carries the same spirit that once propelled him to take improbable risks, a willingness to dismantle what everyone else would cling to. When Discovery pulled the plug on Fast and Loud, the network cited programming shifts and evolving audience interests, but Rawlings' later admission makes clear that the story was more complex. Behind the scenes, creative tension had been building for years. The network wanted predictable drama. Rawlings wanted innovation. Discovery had a formula that worked for viewership metrics, while Rawlings had a vision for a brand that could transcend television. As long as he remained under contract, his creative energy was being siphoned into a narrow pipeline designed for weekly episodes. The moment he recognized that the brand could live without that structure, the countdown to separation began. Ending a long-running show, particularly one synonymous with its creator, is never clean. It means forfeiting a guaranteed platform in exchange for uncertainty. Yet for Rawlings, it represented a return to agency. Without the camera's unblinking gaze dictating narrative, he could finally decide what story to tell. That choice resonates deeply because it reveals how fame can quietly erode autonomy. The very visibility that launches a person can later imprison them. For nearly a decade, his every action had been filtered through producers, editors, and network expectations. The decision to walk away was both personal and philosophical. He was reclaiming ownership of his identity from the machinery of broadcast entertainment. The implications extend beyond Rawlings himself. His story exposes the fundamental tension in reality television. It promises authenticity while demanding performance. The garage was real, the cars were real, the deals were real, but the tempo, the conflicts, the suspense were calibrated for the screen. Over time, that calibration becomes habitual. Life begins to imitate editing. For Rawlings, disentangling from that constructed rhythm meant rediscovering how to live without narrative manipulation. Fans may have seen his confirmation as the end of an era, but for him, it was an opportunity to test whether his persona could survive without the scaffolding of network storytelling. As he reoriented, the broader automotive community took notice. His shift from accumulation to curation mirrored a trend within the collector world, a move away from excess and toward intentionality. Rawlings' decision to reduce his collection sent a quiet but potent message that even in a field defined by material obsession, meaning can come from restraint. The sales symbolized discipline rather than loss. For those who had watched him acquire cars with relentless enthusiasm, seeing him let go of them carried a shockwave of introspection. What does it mean when the man who embodied the dream of limitless acquisition begins to champion reduction? Simultaneously, his exit from Discovery reshaped his business landscape. Freed from contractual boundaries, he could explore partnerships, content, and ventures that had previously been off-limits. He hinted that the next stage would blend digital storytelling, bespoke builds, and lifestyle branding, ventures not confined to traditional broadcasting. In effect, the end of Fast and Loud wasn't a retreat from the public eye, but a strategic pivot towards sovereignty. For Rawlings, autonomy had become the ultimate luxury, one more valuable than any rare automobile. There's a poignant irony here. The man who made his name turning neglected cars into objects of beauty ultimately had to rebuild himself in much the same way. His life had accumulated rust in the form of overexposure, imbalance, and emotional exhaustion. By stripping it down, ending marriages that no longer worked, selling off symbols of the past, walking away from a network that constrained him, he performed a restoration of a different kind. It was slower, quieter, and more introspective than any televised build, but no less intricate. The mechanics of transformation are often similar whether applied to cars or to people. First, you assess what still functions. Then you decide what must go. In Rawlings' case, what still functioned was his entrepreneurial instinct and charisma. What had to go were the constructs that had turned those gifts into burdens. The moment he confirmed the rumors, it became clear that his journey had not been about collapse, but calibration. Every disassembly was a prelude to reinvention. Another layer to consider is the cultural shift around celebrity authenticity. When Fast and Loud premiered, audiences wanted spectacle, big flips, bigger profits, dramatized deadlines. As the decade progressed, viewers began craving transparency, wanting to see the flawed human behind the curtain. Rawlings' eventual openness fits this broader evolution. Instead of defending the myth, he dismantled it himself, acknowledging the contradictions and costs of the image he helped create. That honesty may have seemed risky, but it resonated with a public increasingly skeptical of manufactured perfection. His marriages, revisited through this lens, become less about gossip and more about the clash between mythic masculinity and emotional reality. Rawlings had been cast, by networks, fans, and perhaps himself, as the archetype of rugged independence, the man who needed no one's permission to succeed. That image leaves little room for vulnerability. The relationships that tried to fit within that frame were inevitably distorted. Emotional availability often feels incompatible with perpetual performance. By acknowledging that his lifestyle was inhospitable to partnership, Rawlings reframed failure as consequence rather than flaw, a distinction that adds depth to his story. There's a kind of poetic symmetry in how his personal and professional arcs mirrored each other. Each began with expansion, more cars, more fame, more activity, until the system reached saturation. Then came the reversal, the conscious shedding of weight. In mechanical terms, it's like tuning an engine, removing unnecessary parts to regain efficiency. The sale of cars and the end of Fast and Loud were not symptoms of decline but deliberate tuning decisions. He had recognized that excess, while exhilarating, can also dull performance. When discussing the end of his Discovery contract, Rawlings hinted that creative friction had become untenable. What he didn't need to say aloud was how those same frictions mirror the broader struggle of creative entrepreneurs operating within corporate systems. The network wanted consistency, he wanted evolution. That divergence is familiar to anyone who's watched creators outgrow their platforms. In leaving, Rawlings joined a lineage of figures who realized that control over narrative, schedule, and brand is worth more than guaranteed airtime. It's also important to acknowledge that Rawlings' world is built on risk. Every car deal involves uncertainty. That appetite for risk carried him from local entrepreneur to national star. Yet what distinguishes this latest chapter is the kind of risk he's taking. Not financial, but existential. Selling cars and leaving television required faith that his identity could survive without external validation. It's a quieter, more vulnerable kind of risk, but in many ways, the most daring of his career. The public's fascination with his journey stems partly from the contrast between what he represented and what he became. On screen, he was the embodiment of forward momentum, never still, always scheming, forever chasing the next big score. Off-screen, he has become a figure of introspection, one who recognizes that motion without direction leads to burnout. This transformation challenges the cultural equation that links success with speed. By slowing down, by saying no, Rawlings redefines winning not as expansion, but as alignment. The aftermath of his revelations, though outside the scope of this discussion, suggests that his choices have rippled across the industry. But within the period leading up to and including his confirmation, what stands out is the deliberate way he dismantled the machinery of his old life. Each decision, the divorces, the sales, the cancellation, was a component of that broader process. To outsiders, it may have looked like chaos. To Rawlings, it was precision work. One can imagine him standing in the now emptier garage, the echo of absence where once dozens of engines rested. The silence itself must have been instructive. For years, noise equaled purpose. Now, the absence of noise allowed space for reflection. That silence marked not loss, but possibility. The clean workshop floor before the next build begins. His relationship with Discovery encapsulates a larger theme about creative ownership. For much of the show's run, Rawlings' brand and Discovery's brand were intertwined. Separating them required courage and calculation. Networks prefer predictability. Rawlings' brand thrives on spontaneity. The more success the show achieved, the tighter the network's control became. What began as partnership evolved into constraint. Walking away was not only a financial gamble, but an act of artistic rebellion. It demonstrated that even within mass market entertainment, individuality can assert itself against corporate inertia. The broader implications touch on how fame is sustained in the digital era. Rawlings' willingness to sell tangible assets and exit television in order to preserve autonomy illustrates the shifting value system among modern entrepreneurs. Visibility is no longer the sole currency. Control has overtaken it. In confirming the rumors, he effectively declared independence from both material accumulation and institutional gatekeeping. This decision also carries an ethical resonance. For years, Rawlings' image glorified relentless hustle. The idea that more is always better, that rest is for the uninspired. By stepping back, he indirectly critiques the very myth he once sold. His story becomes a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of perpetual motion. The marriages that unraveled, the collection that shrank, the show that ended, all stand as monuments to a lesson learned the hard way. Velocity without purpose corrodes everything it touches. In examining his journey, it's impossible to ignore the symbolism of the garage itself. Once a stage set for television, it now represents a space of self-definition. Freed from producers and cameras, it returns to what it was meant to be, a workshop, not a spectacle. The removal of cars mirrors the clearing of narrative clutter. What remains is authenticity stripped of theatrics. It's fitting that a man who made his fortune resurrecting old machines would eventually use that same skill set to rebuild his life. The timing of his confirmation, too, carries weight. Coming after years of speculation, it functions as both closure and prologue. By addressing the rumors directly, Rawlings took control of the narrative one last time on his own terms. The gesture underscores a truth about modern celebrity. Silence invites interpretation. Speech reclaims authorship. In speaking, he not only clarified events, but reasserted his agency over how those events would be remembered. Within the framework of entertainment history, his story stands as a microcosm of the life cycle of reality TV fame. The arc is familiar: discovery, explosion, saturation, exhaustion, reinvention. What makes Rawlings' case compelling is his awareness of that cycle and his decision to exit before implosion. Many cling until the ratings collapse. He read the gauges early and eased off the throttle. That strategic restraint demonstrates a mechanical intuition applied to life itself, knowing when to shift gears before the engine blows. The confirmed rumors weave together into a coherent narrative of self-restoration. The failed marriages illustrate the human cost of spectacle. The sale of the car collection reflects the rejection of material identity. The end of Fast and Loud embodies the pursuit of creative and personal sovereignty. Each represents a dismantling of illusion in service of authenticity. There's something deeply fitting about this arc for a man who built his empire around transformation. Every car he touched told a story of rebirth, of decay turned to beauty, of neglect redeemed through craft. His own story follows the same blueprint. By stripping down his life to its chassis, he prepares it for a rebuild not defined by ratings or possessions, but by purpose. And in doing so, Richard Rawlings completes the most complex restoration of his career: the restoration of himself. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on why Richard Rawlings' marriages really failed? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.